This video is going to cover the elements of plot, which means the parts of a narrative or a story. As I review the elements, I'm going to show you how I'd like you to draw them out on a piece of paper. I'd like you to know there's nothing particularly magical about the way I ask you to draw them out. I lay my plot structure out this way simply because I think it fits best on a piece of paper. You've probably seen variations on this before. Stories begin with the exposition. The exposition includes multiple elements, all of which are inside this sort of somewhat triangular shape I've created here. The parts of the exposition are the setting, the characters, and the conflict. It's kind of the introduction to the story. It exposes the key elements of the story. So when you draw your plot structure, you're going to start with these things because this is what will come up first in a story. In the bottom right of the page, you can see we have a box here for the setting. Please note that the setting is both the time and the place. Very often, students want to include only the place in the setting, but the time is also important, as in the time of year, or maybe it's set in the future or the past, or maybe it all takes place in one day. All of that's part of the setting. Then we have these vertical lines, almost vertical lines, slightly angled. This is where you would list key characters in the story, each character's name being written on a line. Remember to label the protagonist and the antagonist. I'll get back to those in just a moment. The third piece of the exposition, in addition to the setting and the characters, is the conflict. The conflict is the main problem or the problems that are being resolved in the story. Short stories often only have one conflict, but when you get into novels, they get more complicated, and there tends to be both internal conflict, meaning conflict within a character that's sort of struggling with something inside of themselves, and external conflict, which could be a character struggling with another character, a character struggling with nature, something outside of themselves is causing the problem. Now, to go back down to protagonist and antagonist, these relate to the conflict. The protagonist is the main character that is having the problem. The antagonist is the thing that's causing the problem. Sometimes the antagonist may not be a character. For instance, if the story is about somebody who's marooned on a desert island by themselves and they're trying to survive, the protagonist, the character experiencing the conflict, is whoever the main character is on the island. But the antagonist in this case, the thing that's causing the problem for the protagonist, is just the situation of being stranded out in nature and needing to try to survive. So while the protagonist will always be a character, the antagonist may or may not be. Another thing to note about protagonists and antagonists is that they don't necessarily mean good guy, bad guy. The protagonist, again, is simply the main character experiencing the problem. So, if we have a story where the main character committed a crime and is on the run from the police, the protagonist, the main character experiencing the problem, is the criminal, and the antagonist is the police who are causing the problem for our criminal by trying to catch him. Okay, so again, it's not good guy, bad guy. It's main character experiencing the problem, protagonist. Character or force causing the problem, antagonist. And remember, another name for the main problem is the conflict. Once all of these things have been exposed, and it's very often within the first paragraph or two in a short story, we have some sort of inciting event. To incite something is to cause it to happen. So the inciting event is really where the conflict is launched, where the main problem is launched. And it gets the story rolling. It causes there to be a story. There is no story if there is no conflict. Okay, that's very important. We need a problem to have a story. Once the inciting event launches the conflict, then we have what's called rising action. Now, I've put spots to put 5 key rising action events here. In a short story, you might have fewer. In a novel, you would certainly have many, many more. There's nothing magical about the number 5 here. Rising action are the key events that happen as the protagonist attempts to resolve the conflict. So these could be things that complicate the problem. These could be things that happen to the character as they're trying to go about solving the problem. But they're key events that happen in the story on the way up to the climax. The climax of the story is the moment of highest tension between the protagonist and antagonist. Remembering that the antagonist could be a force and not a character. Sometimes I hear the climax defined as the moment of, like, the most exciting moment in the story. That's a little bit tricky of a definition because the inciting event, the event that launches the conflict, often is also very exciting. It gets the big problem going. The house blows up or whatever happens. That's pretty exciting too. The climax happens after the protagonist has made some attempts to resolve the problem. And there's the most tension. It's sort of the make or break moment between the protagonist and antagonist. Once the climax occurs, we're going to know who's going to come out on the top. Is the protagonist going to resolve the problem, or is the antagonist going to, overpower the protagonist in some way? So think about that when you think about climax. Now, occasionally, stories end at the climax, and they sort of leave us guessing as to what happens. But more often, there is falling action and then a resolution. You'll notice I wrote falling action, if any, because I'm thinking about this plot structure for short stories. And in short stories, often it's very condensed between the climax and the resolution. But in a novel, there's just about always falling action. These are key events that happen after the climax, where it's like the wrapping up of the loose ends. Finally, we end with the resolution. The resolution is sometimes called the conclusion, just like the exposition is sometimes called the introduction. But really in a narrative, we call them exposition and resolution. And this is how the conflict is resolved, how it ends. Be careful to note that the resolution does not always have to be a happy ending. The problem just has to end. So if the conflict in our story is that somebody is stranded on a desert island and, they see a plane, but they can't get a fire started, is a rising action event. And they start running low on food and they're struggling to feed themselves, is another rising action event or whatever. And the climax comes perhaps at some moment where this person is dying of thirst and they need some water. And they find a lake, and we're not sure, are they going to have the strength to get to that lake or not? And they don't, and they die. That's still a resolution, right? The problem is over for that person. They're no longer experiencing the conflict, okay? Often it is a happy ending, but not always. So that kind of covers the plot structure. Now, you do not need to draw this big circle around the exposition when you draw one of your own, but you do need to include the box for setting, time and place, the lines for characters labeling your protagonist, the main character experiencing the conflict, and your antagonist. And if your antagonist is not a character, you can just list it below the character lines down here. Putting your conflict in this triangle, the main conflict that the protagonist is experiencing. Your inciting event here, key events in the rising action, leading up to the climax, falling action if there is any, and then a box at the end for how does the story actually resolve or conclude.